Saints are more than just pretty statues and pictures. Saints are beings that exist beyond us, out in the universe. They are the spiritual ancestors, or as we would say in our tradition, our ancestors of milk that help us to live our lives better. Many of them have dedicated their existence to other things, and many of them have been attributed to things that we'll talk about patronage when we get into it. Saints are amazingly powerful entities to work with. And today, as we continue our Working with Holy Allies series, we're going to talk about the saints as we walk together down Creation's paths. Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie. I am a Christopagan druid and priest of Bridget.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm a Christopagan druid and sous chef to the Dagda. And since we're talking about saints, today happens to be the feast day of Saint Benedict,
the person who made monasticism what it is in the West and kind of in the East, but mostly in the West. I have so many feelings about Saint Benedict. Many are good. Some are questionable about people who have taken his name in vain. But yeah, we're going to be talking about saints today. And this is going to be a very broad subject. We are probably going to mention certain saints by name, but it's really going to be about saints in general. If you want us to do a deep dive into any particular saint, let us know in the comments, and we will think about coming back and doing a series on particular saints, because I think that there are a lot of saints we could do entire episodes on in a way that would just blow your mind on how useful. We could do an entire week on Saint Christopher, but yeah, did you know that he's a dog-faced man? Also a giant. Before we get into it, if you haven't already, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, whatever the terminology happens to be on whatever app you're listening to us on. We do 5 original Christopagan and Druid episodes Monday through Friday. You don't want to miss a thing because we've got a lot of fun stuff coming up. All right, let's just get into it, shall we? Saints are literally our ancestors in the faith. They come in many shapes, sizes, and varieties. They don't have to have actually been living beings to be a saint or a spirit that we can access. And I'm saying that right up from the gate because Saint Christopher being an example of one, there's a lot of debate over everything from Abraham to Solomon, because historically we can kind of verify that there was a historical Solomon, or at least a legendary King David. We do hear in the historical record about the kings in the line of David, the Davidic kings, but we don't have a lot of historical evidence for anything beforehand. I have an interesting relationship with the idea of Noah and his wife, but do I believe that there was a historical Noah? Actually, I do, but I don't believe that the story is exactly the story that we think he is. But even if there was not a historical Noah, it doesn't matter. Many of the saints are spirits that have become part of the tradition, or if you will, egregores of a collective wish. Spirits willed into being. Was there originally an Adam, Eve, Cain, Lilith? Probably not, but I would say that there probably are spirits now, but that's a whole side issue. Point is, the historicity of a particular saint is not required to work with that saint. Doesn't mean you can just make one up out of whole cloth and pretend that they've always been there. Just because you find out that a saint is not a historical figure like Saint Christopher does not mean that Saint Christopher can not be invoked or actually have an effect in your life. In fact, when I was younger, I was in a group where we were talking about our experiences with the saints. And this woman told a story about how she was in a car crash and she doesn't know how she survived because the car went off the road into the water. And she is convinced that St. Christopher picked her up out of the car and carried her out of the river. They found her on the opposite side of the creek that the car went into, and she would have drowned otherwise. She does not remember taking her seatbelt off. She does not remember getting out of the car. She does have memory of being in someone's arms as they carried her away, but there was no one else. Maybe a good Samaritan dropped her off and left, but she was convinced that St. Christopher got her out of the car. It's not for me or anyone else to say that that's not true, because I wasn't there. I can't say what actually happened, It could have been any number of spirits that did it. It could have been a good Samaritan who helped her out of her car and then left her by the side of the road.
It's not completely unheard of, but it is really far-fetched to think someone would show enough concern to risk drowning themselves to pull someone from a sinking car and go through all that effort just to dump them on the side of the river and go, they're fine now. Someone will find her eventually. She'll wake up.
I think we get a little too lost in historicity when we talk about a lot of things dealing with faith and spirituality. It's all comes back to the story of the Buddha's tooth. Faith has a lot of power in it. And if you believe that that pig's tooth is the Buddha's tooth, it might as well be a relic of the historical Buddha. Go look up the legend of the Buddha's tooth if you don't know what I'm talking about. But I think that that really does explain a lot of faith practices. But the saints, you can find wonderful books and anthologies of the lives of the saints, and they can be fun to read. Some saints have much more active lives and afterlives than others. There are stories of saints sending flocks of ravens after people to get revenge on them and avenging the deaths of the innocents. There are stories about, I can never remember his name when I'm trying to say it, but there's a French saint that called a pack of, after his death, sent a pack of wolves after the thieves that killed him. And the wolves stopped when one of them begged for mercy and repented for killing the man, and then went and gave all the stuff back that he had stolen. There's some wild stories of the saints when you start digging into it. If you want to start working with the saints, I would say pick one of the big name saints that resonates with you, and then start looking into the saints that you're interested in and see who resonates with you. Cyprian is not for everyone, but maybe start with Saint Philomena. Saint Philomena works well for a lot of folk. Most of the biblical saints can be a bit much to work with.
I think for a lot of people, don't start with San Luis. If San Luis starts with you, then you might want to work on whatever you need to work on and work on it fast.
But working with a saint is a devotional practice, and it's one that really teaches you the difference between devotion and worship. Saints very often will stop working with you when you cross that line. And it's a fine line to understand. And it's basically about primacy in your heart. I think one way that might help a lot of people understand this is you worship your spouse. You can be devoted to your friends. The amount of place in your mind, heart, and spirit that your significant other, especially in a monogamous relationship, takes up in your life should be probably greater in your heart than people that you would call friends or best friends. That's the simplest way to describe the difference between devotion and worship. Also, remember, we're working with them. We tend not to try to bribe saints to give us miracles, though there are saints that are known for their miracles.
A lot of that goes because if you try to bribe San Luis, you're going to get clubbed upside the head. Whereas some of the others, that type of relationship works with them because it is right for them.
Saint Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of lost causes, or the saint of final repose, is you light a candle and say a prayer. And I have found in my life very often that Saint Jude Thaddeus will respond very quickly to those prayers. Every saint has their own way of acting. It is like learning to have a relationship with a friend. You need to learn their stories. You need to learn more about them. There may be traditional prayers that are associated to devotion to them, and those are a good thing to learn. They may have a chaplet, which is like a rosary, but dedicated to a saint. There will be very specific prayers to that saint or related to that saint that are recited. They don't always follow the pattern of the rosary. Many of them are in sets of 3 or 7 instead of the groups of 10 that you find on a classic Dominican rosary. Learning the ins and outs of the devotions to a saint is very important in how you want to actually approach them. Doing some fact checking could really be helpful. I always had a weird feeling about St. George and didn't quite understand why anyone would have a devotion to St. George. The only things that I knew about St. George is that he was a dragon slayer and that he was the patron saint of England. And actually a lot of countries have adopted him as patron saint. And when I started looking at the story about St. George, I got a very different understanding of him because he taught a very simple rule of basically, if you can stand up and take care of the defenseless, you should do it. You have an obligation. If you have the power to help others, you help others, and that we are always working together for the good of all. My opinions of St. George changed when I got into the stories about St. George. He wasn't just a dragon slayer. He wasn't simply this iconic image that we have of him. And thus my relationship with him developed and grew from there. Like I said, devotion to saints looks different depending on who the saint is. I do pray sometimes to St. Julian, as in Julian of Norwich. Most of the time, I just recite the Julian mantra, all shall be well, all shall be peace. In that, knowing that she is present and that her guidance is there to help me see the revelation of divine love and grace in my life. Yes, sometimes I talk to her directly, but a lot of times I just recite this phrase that she is known for. That's something that you will learn saint by saint. And other practices you won't resonate with as strongly.
I think that's one of the things working with saints, because there's so many of them and so varied. When you're doing your own work, a lot of that research should be coming in at the beginning, because you need to ask yourself, like, what are you looking for? If you're trying to work on an aspect of your life that you want to improve, having a clear idea of what you're wanting to work on and what you want to improve, finding a saint whose story is kindred to that can be a very good relationship to build. And it can be tricky at first. Odds are you're wanting to work in that area because you're very deficient in it.
Or because you need something.
Yeah, or because you need something.
People first turn to the saints because of disease, sickness, or something else, and will go to one of the saints that's known for healing that particular ailment. But this is where I would say be mindful of going to a saint because they are listed as the patron saint of something. Those are post hoc declarations of the church.
Like trying to rely on crib notes.
It's the church trying to give the assignment to a heavenly ancestor. And
okay,
some of them are fine, okay, and do it. And others I have not had as good luck with. But also, just because somebody is listed as the patron saint of a thing. So, for example, I'm a writer, and the patron saint of writers is St. Francis de Sales. So I read up on him. I started reading his writings. I just don't feel it. I tried praying to him. I tried developing a devotion to him to get him more in my life, and nothing. It did not click with me at all. That working relationship never came about. And in fact, I had a much better work relationship with St. Clare of Assisi, who is the patron saint of television and radio, and by extension, podcasters. And that's based on a joke. She is almost always shown holding a monstrance that reminded people of the old school microphones used in television and radio. And that's why that connotation came about. But I found her much more willing to help and reach out than other saints. My patron saint of creativity and writing is usually St. Mary Magdalene. I find that mainly because St. Mary Magdalene is a catch-all saint. I don't think I know of anything that she's not good for help with. I have a very strong devotion to Mary Magdalene, and she is very willing to be of aid and help in almost everything. But just because I find a special devotion to her when it comes to my writing doesn't necessarily mean that you will. That may not be the kind of relationship that you develop with her. So one thing that you might want to think about is who is the saint whose writing you particularly like, because a lot of the saints were writers. Maybe that's the saint that you should be going to for that particular thing. You see what I'm saying? I think St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who is the first native-born American saint, is a great help in a lot of things. She is very motherly. She really does take care of us. And living in this country, she has a very strong connection to this country and wants the best for it. In fact, her father threw the inaugural ball for George Washington. Just to give you an idea how tied into these United States she is. I have a very strong devotion to her and used to volunteer and visit her shrine in Emmitsburg, Maryland a lot. I was entrusted with a relic of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton that I have in the house. I have a very strong relationship with her. I can't recommend her enough. She wrote a lot. There's a lot you can actually read of her own writing, and maybe you'll connect with her that way. Maybe you won't, but that is something you should try to do. You should try to have a connection, especially if it's a saint you want to work with, as opposed to just invoke occasionally. There's nothing wrong with being in a state of trouble where you need to call on a saint for protection and have not developed a previous relationship with them. But I think it's a very good practice and a much better practice to have kind of a coterie of saints that you have developed relationships with, that you can call on throughout your life. You've developed that faith that they will come to your aid. We've listed some of ours. Saint Sarah is a big saint for me. I pray to her a lot. I find a very strong connection to her. It's hard for my brain to include Mary with the saints, so she is technically a saint, but Blessed Mother Mary, I have a very strong devotion to. I have developed a strong relationship with quite a few saints over the years. If you're going to develop a relationship, you need to be thinking about it like starting a friendship. How many friendships can you really handle?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people treat the saints like Pokemon and they want to catch them all. And that's great if you just want saints that you can invoke from time to time.
One thing I've learned with interacting with a lot of different saints, that they know it's in your heart. And if you're just collecting them to collect them, they won't be trophies. They're not going to stick around. They're not going to show up. But if you're genuinely in need, they're going to show up and help. But even then, it's going to be it's passive because your heart's not in the right spot. You definitely have your heart in the right place. Not to mention bringing them in. And if your heart's not in the right spot, they will meddle in your life. Once they've been invited into your life, will meddle in your life.
They will.
Like, for instance, Saint Louis de Montfort, I was developing a relationship. I was studying Mary and developing a relationship with Mary. And I invited Saint Louis in to help get a better understanding. And this was wonderful. We were working out great, having good times, but also I can be undisciplined. I felt like I was in British training again.
Yeah.
And there was the monk with the rattan stick helping me with my posture. You smell those apples, I'm about to get hit.
Having said that, there are a lot of ways to know when you're working with a saint, and the smell of sweet apples is actually something that is associated with Saint Louis de Montfort very strongly. Of course, the scent of roses with Mary and with several other saints. As you start learning more about them, and always so weird saying this because it has other connotations outside of Catholicism, but the cult of the particular saint that you're dealing with, there are things you will not normally come into contact with when you start getting into the devotion and what the devotion to that particular saint entails. You will start noticing that there are often various scents, various perfumes, incenses that are often used in devotion with that saint, various items that are seen as related to them that are used in devotional work with them. It really is something to drill in on and really connect with. For some saints, you're going to have to ask yourself what you think about them and be okay with the ambiguity. When I say I have a very strong devotion to Saint Sarah, yes, I'm talking about Sarah Lacali, and I do not force onto anyone my views of who she is. And I say it that way because there are many, not just one, there are many stories about who Sarah is and what Sarah means. And I have my own view. That's the relationship I have developed with her. That's where you're going to get into that choose your own adventure book of the saints and how you want to view their backstory. Mary Magdalene is a big one in this because which of the graves of Mary Magdalene do you think she was actually buried in? Do you believe she's in France? Do you believe she's in Turkey? Do you believe she's in Egypt? Where did she go after the Gospels? There are a lot of versions of her story afterwards. You're going to see which versions of those stories you connect with. This is where I think a lot of people get lost in the historicity of things. I don't think it matters where her bones are, personally. I could be entirely wrong when I say that I believe her bones are in the south of France. That belief in me is related to the stories that I believe about her and her relationship as the apostle of the apostles, in her position as the Magdalene, as the tower of faith, and how I relate to her. And that's what you're going to learn when you have these opposing stories. It's not uncommon to find them with the saints, especially some of the older ones that everyone wanted a piece of. You'll start finding that saints miraculously traveled all over the place. Saint Mary Agreda, for example, wrote The Mystical City of God. There are numerous stories about her in New Mexico. She lived in Spain in the 1500s. She wasn't like just getting on a flight out to New Mexico and flying back.
Yeah.
but people during her lifetime had visions of her in New Mexico. That is part of the story of St. Mary Agreda. You have to ask yourself, do you believe those stories if she is somebody that you choose to develop a devotion to? I personally love her books. I do not have a devotion to her. Tried it out, did not fit for me. And again, highly admired the mystical city of God, but not a devotee of hers, in the same way that I am of Julian. The more I learn about Julian of Norwich, the more I love her. And so that's really the question you have to ask yourself. Which version of these stories are you going to relate to? How do you relate to them? You'll learn a lot about yourself in that process. There's one Mary Magdalene, but there are a myriad of ways to see her. And you're just picking the lens that you're using to bring her into focus.
One of the other ones that I like to look at as a clear example for this is St. Francis. People think of St. Francis and preaching to the animals as someone who communes with nature, communes with animals. And a lot of times they don't think of the more Don Quixote tilting at windmills, St. Francis, who charged off.
I will be right. Why do I have so much money?
Yeah. Oh, my rich dad's being a jerk. Fine. Here, you can have the shirt off my back and everything. I disinherit myself and storm out of the courtroom. Like, I'm to build a church. Francis has a lot of different facets that go into this one saint. Be aware that all of that is part of it, and different facets may fit different points in your life.
And Francis has
so many good stories.
If you're interested in St. Francis, get yourself the Little Flowers of St. Francis and read some of the early legends about him and Brother Leo. And then go from there. St. Bonaventure wrote two wonderful, the Legend of Minor and the Legend of Major, that are biographies of Francis. And I highly recommend both of those as well. If you can't tell, I have a devotion to St. Francis, both of us do. I hope this has helped you learn how to work with the saints better. I hope that you have found a little bit more knowledge and are maybe a little bit more curious about how you can work with them and bring their energy more into your life. I'd love to know your experience with the saints down in the comments. If you want to talk about what saints you have patronage with, that you have developed relationships with, and maybe even some wonderful stories about your own interactions with the saints, I'd love to hear all.
If you're listening to us on YouTube, Spotify, or CreationsPaths.com, you can leave a comment right there. If you're listening to us anywhere else, even if they say you can leave a comment, they don't notify us, so we won't know. But you can leave a comment there anyway, because engagement is magic. And then head over to CreationsPaths.com, click on chat, and you can leave a message there, and we will see it, and we will be able to get back to you. While you're there, if you happen to have a few dollars, you can pass our way. We offer monthly and annual memberships. You can also support us on Patreon and Ko-fi. I am CE Dorset on both, and you can support us using the Cash App hashtag CreationsPaths. Thank you to everybody who does that. We are ever so grateful. Thank you so much. You all really do help us keep the lights on, keep a roof over our head, and food on our table. If we've ever said anything that's helped you out, please share it with others. That helps us out more than you know.
My sweet, blessed Saint Magdalene, Tower of Faith, apostle to the apostles, guide us in all that we do and help us as the shining beacon you are to find our way in this world. Help us to find the saints that we should work with, that will make our lives great, grand, and glorious, and that we may ever be about doing the work of the gospel. Amen.
Amen.